Israeli-Arab conflict is arguably the most intractable, the most explosive issue in the world today. It spanned nearly the entire 20th century and now into the 21st. Yet, though there may be no end in sight, it does have a beginning. Historically, the origins of the conflict go back 90 years, but geographically they can be traced thousands of kilometers from Palestine to northern England, to the country seat of one English aristocrat. This was once the home of Sir Mark Sykes, a man central to British involvement in the Middle East. What's happening in the region today is not just a continuation of history, but a repetition. For nearly a century, there have been British public figures who've mixed politics and religion, seeking to impose their own messianic vision on the Middle East, with disastrous consequences for those who live there. June 2007, Tony Blair, now the British ex-Prime Minister, is appointed as an international envoy to the Middle East, representing the quartet made up of the European Union, Russia, the United Nations and America. But his appointment caused outrage among some observers.
He's completely unfit to hold that post. He only sees the conflict from the Israeli perspective, that they are dealing with terrorists. It's only the Americans who pushed for him, and he got this job, and the Americans pay for his mission, not the quartet.
But Tony Blair is only the latest in a long list of British Prime Ministers who made the Middle East their business. Britain's modern association with the Holy Land goes back to the First World War, and a time when it was looking for new allies against Germany. The Arabian Sharif of Mecca was an obvious choice. He promised to unite the Arabs and rise against Germany's allies, the Ottoman Turks. In return, Britain officially promised in 1915 to assist him realize his dream, to be the supreme Arab ruler of an independent Arab kingdom. Britain sent troops to fight with him and paid him the equivalent in today's money of $500 million. But at the same time, the Brits, in conjunction with the French, were busy redrawing the map of the region, dividing it into spheres of influence. Britain would have Iraq and Jordan. France would have Syria and Lebanon. Contrary to earlier promises, there would be no independent Arab state, though no one told this to the Arabs. The fate of the Arabs was in the hands of Mark Sykes, the most powerful among a group of young adventurer politicians who, irrespective of their lack of experience, were given a free hand to draw borders and create states.
So when the war broke out in 1914, he was considered as a Middle East expert, although he wasn't an expert, and he was attached to the war cabinet as a Middle East expert just for the reason that he had traveled in the Middle East.
Those travels were Sykes' ticket to government. Together with his religion, he'd converted to Catholicism, they sparked a lifelong passion for the region. Sykes' missionary zeal is on display across the road from his house. The folly in the village of Sledmere was built by his father, but it was Mark Sykes himself who filled all the plaques with figures of his comrades who died in the First World War, dressed as crusaders. The best he saved for himself. He's the crusader holding a sword and standing on the defeated Saracens, with Jerusalem in the background. The scroll above his head reads, Leatara Jerusalem, rejoice Jerusalem.
Quite a few of the British political establishment were religious, and Zionism appealed to them because of its biblical associations. And there was not just one or two individuals, but there was a whole category of senior British officials who can be called and have been called collectively as the Gentile Zionists.
Zionists, the European Jews who believed in the right of Jews everywhere to live in Palestine, were also on the lookout for allies.
From the beginning, the Zionist movement realized that it had to engage the major powers of the day. Initially, it was the Ottoman Empire, but very quickly it was Britain. And so you found a very powerful Zionist lobby being set up within Britain to push for British support for a Jewish homeland and ultimately a state in Palestine.
Mark Sykes was very willing to go along with that shift in British policy because he was also very pro-Zionist. He was particularly close to Dr. Chaim Weizmann, the veteran Zionist leader.
Chaim Weizmann was the face of Zionism in the UK and 30 years later was to become the first president of Israel. Born in a Russian village, Weizmann came to Britain in 1904 to teach at Manchester, where he became friends with a certain local member of parliament called Arthur Balfour, and then later to London to lobby the government for a promise to aid Zionist efforts to create in Palestine a homeland, possibly a state, for the world Jews. From this house in West London, Weizmann and his Zionist colleagues successfully appealed to a wide range of influential government officials, journalists and businessmen. They approached the religious, the imperialist, even the anti-Semitic. The result was to be a marriage between Western colonialism and political Zionism.
Sir Mark Sykes was the secretary to the cabinet and he pushed very hard for the Balfour Declaration. And Dr. Weizmann was sitting outside the cabinet room when the Balfour Declaration was being discussed. And when a decision was taken in favor of issuing a declaration, Sir Mark Sykes came out of the room and said, "Dr. Weizmann, it's a boy," meaning it's good news.
The newborn was the Balfour Declaration, a 120-word letter dated November 2nd, 1917, addressed to Walter Rothschild, the London-based Zionist leader and banker.
His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine.
That evening, Rothschild celebrated in London's Opera House, telling his elated audience that the declaration represented the greatest event that has occurred in Jewish history for 1800 years. But the Jewish triumph would become a Palestinian catastrophe.
Clearly, from a Palestinian point of view, the Balfour Declaration is a biased document. But I think Britain has genuinely tried since then to maintain an unbiased policy towards the Middle East.
The Balfour Declaration, named after the foreign minister of the time, was not entirely of British making. The then American President Woodrow Wilson gave his support to it after being lobbied by American Zionists. Nor was the declaration principally Balfour's.
The real driving force behind it was the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George. And therefore, he's the key person behind the declaration. And his thinking was rather detached from reality.
He says, look, I know more about the Old Testament than the New Testament. I know more about the Jewish religion than Christianity. I was educated like that. I was brought up like that. The way they justify the Balfour Declaration, they justify it in a kind of historical, cultural, deeply rooted way, i.e. Zionism is part of our culture.
At that time, the notion of a promised land was a common biblical theme throughout Britain. And not just then. It was also very much in the mind of one modern Prime Minister.
Everybody knew that Tony Blair was a deeply Christian person with deep religious beliefs. There was no doubting that his Christianity, and perhaps some might even argue his Catholicism, played an important part in forming his character.
The Balfour Declaration was born out of these sentiments. No doubt it was a blessing for the Zionists, but it was a curse for the Palestinians. Their land, and despite the careful wording, their rights too, were promised away.
What is often forgotten is that there are two parts to the Balfour Declaration. The first was Britain's undertaking to help the Jews have a homeland of their own. The second was to ensure that the indigenous people of Palestine protected their religious and civil rights. It's a part of the Balfour Declaration which is often forgotten.
Others put a different slant on this second part.
This idea that one group, which wasn't in Palestine, will have national rights and political rights, and the other group will have less rights, subservient rights, subordinate rights, inferior rights, if you like. Those indigenous people described in the Balfour Declaration as non-Jewish community, these are the 95% of the population. This is really a guiding principle of British policies in the Middle East, i.e. the Palestinians have rights, but these rights are conditional.
One of Zionism's greatest triumphs was to lobby the British government to send Herbert as the first High Commissioner to occupied Palestine. Samuel was a Jewish Zionist, and he enabled the Zionists to develop their institutions and expand their political agenda.
He was very proud that under his governorship, the number of settlements increased from this number to this number, and this is what he wrote reports to the British government. More important thing about settlements and Samuel is the way he allowed them to arm themselves. This was seen as the nucleus of the Haganah, which was the nucleus of the Israeli army.
To this day, the settlements issue remains central to the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's about how much land Israel should be allowed to extend its authority over, whether for security, demographic or religious reasons. British rule by mandate would last 3 decades, until May 15, 1948. On that day, the Jews, most of whom had arrived during that period, proclaimed an independent state and called it Israel. During the next decades, Friends of Israel organisations were established inside all the main British political parties. They were to have a huge impact on British politics and on British policy in the Middle East.